The final year of a long, long war, another quiet threat arrived. It didn't roar like cannon fire. It whispered. It moved in silence, from ship to shore, from city to village, carried not by soldiers, but by breath. People called it many things: the Spanish flu, the Blue Death, the invisible storm. And yet, in the homes it entered, life went on. Children played in empty alleys. Letters arrived with careful hands. Tea cooled in chipped porcelain cups. This is not a story of battles or kings or victory. This is the victory of how the world whispered and how ordinary people lived quietly through the loudest silence of all. Part 1. The morning after the news. It is cool morning. In the autumn 1918, the sky is pale. The light enters your room slowly, filtered through the thin curtain your grandmother stitched years ago. You hear nothing outside, no horses, no market chatter, not even a milk cart. You sit up in bed. Your breath makes a soft loud in the cold air. There was news yesterday, quiet but heavy. A new kind of illness is spreading. It doesn't wear a uniform, but it marches through cities and towns like a silent army. They say it came from somewhere far away, or perhaps it began right here. No one is certain. You move slowly through your morning. Water from the basin feels colder than usual. You pour tea and wait longer for it to cool, even though it's already lukewarm. Your neighbor doesn't open their shop today. A small note hangs on the window. It simply reads closed until further notice. There are fewer footsteps in the street. People speak in low voices, or not at all. You button your coat, one slow movement at a time. And as you prepare to step outside, you wonder, will life go on as before, or will this be the morning everything changed? Part 2. Masks made of cloth and hope. There was a time not so long ago when you could walk the streets and see faces. You would greet neighbors with a smile, a nod, or a raised brow. Small gestures we never imagined losing, but now there are masks everywhere, not the kind worn for theater. These were cloth, gauze, flour sacks, or old handkerchiefs, folded twice, then tied tightly behind the ears. They weren't perfect. Doctors said they helped a little, and sometimes a little was all people had. Mothers stitched masks by candlelight. Sewing machines hummed in back rooms, not for races, but for something called protection. Some made masks from curtains, others used lace. Children wore them too, though the elastic often slipped behind tiny ears. In the cities, posters urged wear a mask and save a life, but not everyone did. Some thought it was silly, some felt it made no difference, and some, quietly simply, had no mask to wear. Still, people tried. They adjusted them before entering shops. They hung them by the door when they returned. They wore them to funerals, rows of quiet eyes above quiet cloth. Masks did not make people safe, but they gave people something to do, something to hold on to, a sign that you cared. A gesture that said, I see you, and I hope we make it through. Part 3. Streets gone still. There is a sound that only silence makes, a kind of hush that presses against your ears when you step outside and realize the world is missing. The streets are still, not empty, exactly, just paused. Shops are shuttered, not for the evening, not for a holiday, but for something longer, a kind of waiting no one can name. Market stalls sit under canvas covers, bread baskets untouched, fruit bruising in the autumn sun. You walk past the barber's chair, always busy, always loud, and find it still. A white sheet half draped, scissors untouched. Even the birds seem quieter now, even the wind. There are no children skipping rope, no wagons clattering down stone paths, just a creak of a sign swaying in rusted chains. Just your own shoes muffled on damp cobblestone. And yet life hasn't vanished. A curtain shifts in an upstairs window. A kettle whistles far off in someone's kitchen. A dog barks once, then forms silence again. You begin to notice these things, small sounds, small motions, as if the world has not stopped, only slowed. And maybe that is what survival looks like, not rushing forward, but pausing and listening to the stillness that holds everything in place. 4. Letters, not touch. In times of illness, the thing most feared wasn't always death. It was far away and silence, to be kept apart from those you love, to be told not to visit, not to embrace, to be near but not touch. But people wrote letters. Some were sent, some were left at doors, some were never mailed at all, just folded neatly, as if the act of writing might somehow carry the message through air. Ink became touch, paper became a voice, and envelopes, small vessels of feeling. They wrote to their mothers, I am still well. Wrote to their children, do not worry. To their friends, they hadn't seen in months. When this ends, let's have a tea. The words were simple, not poetry, but presence. Some added rest, flowers. Some included a lock of hair. Some just signed their name as if that were enough. Mailmen became lifelines. Even the sound of letters sliding through the door felt like a heartbeat. And so, across town and cities, hands passed folded paper with trembling fingers, not for business, not for news, just for each other. Because in 1918, a letter was more than ink and parchment. It was the only kind of closeness the world could allow. Part 5. Quarantine rooms. The door shut softly behind them. No lock, but no need for one. Inside the room, a single bed, a chipped basin, one chair, and a ticking clock that didn't seem to stop. Here, quarantine meant stillness. It meant a body alone in space, counting coughs, sealing cracks, and how long sunlight touched the opposite wall. Meals came on trays, left outside the door. No knock, only the sound of footsteps fading down the hallway. Some rooms had windows, others had only a slit of light beneath the door, and silence, a silence that grew heavy by the hour. People left messages of paper slips, sometimes slipped under the doors, sometimes not answered. They waited for the fever to break, or the breathing to slow, or the door to open again, with someone they loved on the other side. Sometimes it did, and sometimes the clock was the only one left listening. Part 6. Soap, Water, and Anxiety. In another time, soap was a luxury, a scented bar on a shelf, a tool for comfort, not compulsion. In 1918, soap became something else. It became fear. It became a ritual. People scrubbed with urgency, as if lather could chase the virus away. Hands were red, raw, cracked at the knuckles from overwashing. Cold water, no lotion, no rest. Parents taught children, sing the alphabet as you scrub. Neighbors whispered recipes for homemade antiseptics made for vinegar and ash. Some didn't trust it. Some said soap was useless, that illness floated in the air, and washing was like hiding from fog. But most tried, because to wash was to act, to do something when the sickness had taken control of everything else. So the basin stayed filled, towels stayed damp, and the soap, cracked, small, was worn down day after day by hands that just wanted to feel a little safer. Part 7. The things they whispered. People didn't know what to believe. Not really. Not in 1918. Some said it came from the trenches. Others from ships. Some blamed foreigners. Some blamed the weather. Some said it was a curse. But most didn't say anything aloud. They whispered behind curtains, behind hands, in kitchens, over weak tea, on porches, with one eye on the road. Did you hear she's coughing now? They say it travels on the wind. Boil your handkerchiefs every night. The newspapers were filled with numbers, but numbers didn't explain why one child survived and the other didn't, or why the priest got sick but the grocer didn't. So people made their own explanation. Superstition stood where science had not yet arrived. They hung garlic by the door. They burned vinegar in pans. They boiled onions and kept the water. Some wore pouches of herbs around their necks. Others just prayed. Sometimes a knock at the door meant news. Sometimes it meant nothing. Sometimes it was worse than both. In towns across the world, people clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, something small, something simple, might keep the sickness out. And so they whispered, because in 1918, whispers were safer than hope and quieter than grief. Part 8. Schools without voices. The bell still rang each morning. The sound echoed across empty streets, not as a call, but as a memory. as if the building itself had forgotten no one was coming. In 1918, schools tried to remain open. At first, some classrooms had 5 students, some had none, and yet the chalkboards were wiped clean each day, and the windows opened for air that never seemed clean enough. Desks sat in rows, waiting, notebooks curled at the edges from the damp, and teachers stood at the front of the room, reading aloud to no one, because for a while no one knew what was safer to stay or to send them home. Some children coughed in class, others never returned. Their seats were not reassigned. Instead, a small flower might appear on a desk, or a folded note, or just nothing at all. In some towns, schools became hospitals, or morgues, or kitchens to feed the families left behind. And yet, the rhythm of education tried to continue. Lessons were left at doorsteps. Books were mailed. Homework was done by candlelight, checked by worry mothers. But it wasn't the same, because learning depends on laughter, on shared glances, on chalk dust and playground arguments. And in 1918, the playgrounds were silent, the jump rope stilled, the walls once loud with recitation, now whispered back only echoes. They called it temporary, but children knew better. They always do. Part 9. Hands that weren't held. They said it was safer this way, to stay apart, to wait from windows, to send notes instead of hugs, to break instead of hold, and so people said goodbye without touch, without a kiss on the forehead, without a hand to squeeze, without even a final whisper. In many homes, if someone got sick, they were moved to a separate room, a room with a closed door, and no one else inside. Meals were left on trays outside. Conversations happened through the wood. No one dared cross the line between the healthy and the unwell, because the line was life itself. Children stood in tiptoe to peek through doorways. Mothers watched from across the room, arms aching with absence. Fathers sat outside, staring at walls that suddenly mattered too much. And when it ended, when the breath faded, the silence was absolute, not just in sound, but in all the things that were left undone. No hands held, no lullabies sung, no final warmth shared. In 1918, grief became a private thing, a quiet ritual, with no witnesses, not because people were cruel, but because they were scared. So they buried their sorrow was as carefully as they buried their dead. And even years later, some still flinch when someone reached out to touch their hand, because sometimes the greatest loss is not who you lose, but how you had to let them go. Part 10. Streets that stopped moving. They say cities never sleep, but in 1918, they did. And when they did, the silence was louder than any ground. The street stopped moving. Carriages slowed. Bicycles rested by doorways. Even the wind seemed unsure of its direction. Shops stayed closed, some boarded, others just forgotten. Chalk signs faded in the rain, mailboxes overflowed, dust settled where doorsteps used to echo. You could walk for blocks and hear nothing but the tapping of your own shoes, a cough in the distance, the cry of a child through a window, and sometimes not even that. Cities that once rang with bells, barrels, and shouting vendors now held their breath. Markets were quiet. Churches still. Cafes sat with chairs on tables, as if waiting for a tomorrow that wouldn't come. Even the animals noticed. Stray dogs wandered in straight lines. Pigeons circled slower. Horses stood without harness or purpose. Some said it felt like a dream, others like the end. But in truth, it was a pause, a deep, painful pause, where time moved, but people didn't. And in that stillness, cities remembered how fragile they really were. Not just their buildings, but their breath, their voices, and they need to gather. Because when the streets stopped moving, you realize what made them alive was never the stone, but the souls. Part 11. Cops Behind Curtains. By the time the streets had quieted into a new kind of normal, people had learned how to listen and how to pretend not to. In those fog-wrapped European cities of late autumn 1918, a cough was no longer a private matter. It came from behind wooden doors, echoed from the third floor of an aging apartment, or trickled out from the dark end of a hallway. And each time it didn't just jaunt the one who coughed, it unsettled the entire building. People began to notice silence could be comforting, but a sound at the wrong moment was a signal. A dry cough, faint or sharp, during daylight or after midnight, sent shivers down stairwells. Neighbors paused. Some crossed to the other side of the street. Others changed their daily route just to avoid a doorstep that felt too close. Behind a tin curtain, a young mother held back her breath, sipping vinegar-steeped water in the dark, hoping her child wouldn't wake to hear the raps in her chest. She feared the neighbors would hear it too, and perhaps fear her. Children whispered to one another, "That house coughed again." Grown-ups said nothing. They knew that in these days, rumors spread faster than the illness itself. No one wanted to be the one whose home bore the sound that silenced a neighborhood. It crammed flats where 3 generations shared 4 walls. A cough wasn't just a symptom. It was the beginning of isolation, of makeshift medicine bottles on dinner tables, of sleepless nights, of glances exchanged across rooms filled with unspoken fear. And then there were the coughs no one heard anymore, not because they had faded, but because the voices behind them were gone. Curtains no longer moved. Windows stayed shut. Those were the quietest homes of all, among brick walls and shared ceilings. People lived with a fear not of noise, but of a very specific one. Not sirens, not alarms, just a cough, dry, hollow, slow. It knocked on doors like a messenger no one wished to greet, and everyone listened, even when they pretended not to. Part 12. Doctor in Dust Coats. They didn't wear capes or even clean uniforms. Most of the time, they wore the same dusty overcoats day after day, pockets sagging with folded notes, vials of bitter medicines, and handkerchiefs used more times than they should have been. The doctors of 1918 were tired, and visibly so. They walked the street like ghosts, some on bicycles, others in worn boots, not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward, from one house to the next. They had no mask, like we know today, sometimes only a cloth tied around the mouth, sometimes nothing at all. They knew little of the virus, only that it was everywhere, and that it waited in the lungs of the people they were trying to save. When they knocked, it was not always welcome. Not everyone trusted them, but those who did, those who opened the door, looked into the eyes of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Doctors slept in corners of train stations, in borrowed chairs, with a satchel of pills for a pillow. Their fingers smelled of camphor and menthol. Their notebooks were filled with trembling handwriting and crossed out names. Some carried little bottles of whiskey in their coats, not for drinking, but to rub on the hands before, after each visit. Others held onto Lucky Charms or breast flowers between pages of their medical notes, anything to remind them of something gentle. They didn't always succeed. Most of the time they didn't, but they kept walking, through snow, through silence, through doorways filled with fear. They knew too much and yet too little. Every cough behind a door, every feverish face, every hand that trembled when it reached for help. These were the only charts they truly needed. By the time they got home, if they had a home to return to, their coats were heavier than when they'd left, not with supplies, but with sorrow. Part 13. Beds turned to words. The bedroom once smelled of clean sheets and morning light. Now it smells of vinegar and sickness. Once a place for rest, the bed has become something else entirely. The pillows are flattened, damp with sweat. The sheets have been boiled too many times, losing both their softness and their color. Every surface holds a story of fever, of waiting, of hands held and let go. In 1918, hospitals overflowed quickly, too quickly, and so homes became wards, bedrooms became sick rooms, dining tables turned into spaces for bandages and broth. Families rearranged their homes not for comfort, but for care. Sometimes one room held 3 patients. Sometimes the only healthy person left was the one tending to them all. The lines between public and private blurred. Medical charts were kept on kitchen counters. Thermometers rested beside soup spoons. Bottles of aspirin and holy water shared the same shelf. People hung blankets between beds to offer a little privacy, or to hide how sick someone had become. There were whispers not to disturb the sick, There were long silences when no one wanted to ask, "Is she breathing?" And sometimes they weren't. Windows stayed open even in the cold to let the sickness out. Children tiptoed through hallways, glancing toward closed doors. Mothers didn't sleep. They sat beside their loved ones, listening for every cough, every breath, or the sudden absence of one. Doctors came when they could, often too late. Nurses passed through for a few minutes, leaving behind cloth masks, instruction, and worry. But for most, care came from within the house, from trembling hands, from love, and when it was over, one way for another, the sheets were boiled again, and the bed reset, ready, just in case. Part 14. The smell of menthol and vinegar. Before the doctors arrived, if they arrived at all, people turned to what they had. The scent of menthol hung heavy in homes, sharp and clean, chasing away the stillness of fever and fear. Vicks rubbed on chest, eucalyptus drops on pillows, old tin salves warmed between hands and applied gently beneath noses. The air reeked of effort, of trying. Vinegar, too, made its mark, soaked into cloths, wiped across door handles, poured into steaming basins. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar, astringent, biting, and strangely comforting. Mothers boiled rats in water laced with vinegar, then pressed them to the forehead of the sick. It didn't cure, but it gave the hands something to do, something to hope for. Garlic hung near beds. Onions were cut and placed in corners, said to absorb the illness. Some swore the kerosene rubbed on their feet. Others burned herbs or waved a matchstick through the air, believing the flame cleansed what the nose could not see. Every smell told a story, not of science, perhaps, but of intention, of traditions passed down and improvised solutions. These were acts of care in a world that felt increasingly uncaring. For some, it was the scent of whiskey on a cloth, dabbed onto the throat with trembling hands. For others, it was camphor tucked into the edge of a pillow, peppermint oil dotted on collars, cloves simmering in pots. These were the fragrances of the fight, not against the virus directly, but against the fear, the waiting, the helplessness. They were rituals repeated daily, longingly, desperately. They filled the silence when words had run out. They gave an illusion of control. In 1918, science was still catching up, so families leaned on memory, belief, and scent, and in homes across the world, the perfume of hope lingered, bitter, pungent, sharp, and unforgettable. Part 15. The sound of nothing. The night used to hum. Before the sickness, the city breathed, even after dark. Footsteps echoed from cobblestones. Laughter spilled from doorways. The clink of bottles, the slow creak of shutters, even the sound of someone playing piano down the block, faint but familiar. But now the city holds its breath. At night, Silence spreads across the rooftops and settles in the alleyways. No music, no carriage, no late night calls, just the ticking of clocks and the muffled cars behind closed doors. The streets are empty, not quiet, empty, a kind of quiet that presses against the chest, too wide, too deep, the kind of quiet that feels like waiting. Even the bells have gone still, no church songs, no wedding peals, no tolling for the hour, just the wind, sometimes, and the occasional creak of old wood as the building seemed to shift under the weight of it all. People whisper instead of speak. They move carefully, as if noise itself could break someone. Chairs are pulled out gently. Windows are closed without a sound. A spoon stirred in tea sounds almost loud. The world has grown soft around the edges, faded. Inside, families huddle in dim light, speaking in half voices. Radios are turned down. Children ask questions, and parents answer with their eyes, not words. Even arguments have fallen quiet, replaced with glances and long silences. There is no celebration, no festival, no reason to gather. The days blur together, and the nights are longer than ever. But in that stillness, something else appears, the faint sound of breathing from the next room, the gentle crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of a pencil against paper, small human sounds, the kind that mean someone is still there, someone is still listening, still alive. And so the quiet remains, not peace, not fear, just the sound of nothing, and in that nothing, everything. Part 16. Baking bread for the sick. It started in quiet kitchens, long before the sun came up. A bowl of flour, a bit of water, salt if there was any left, yeast carefully saved, sometimes passed from neighbor to neighbor like treasure. Hands moved without hurry, kneading, folding, shaping, as though the dough itself held some small power. The bread wasn't for sale, it wasn't for celebration. It was for someone across the street, someone 2 doors down, someone who hadn't been seen at their window in days. People bake it, not because they had much, but because they had something. And when the world felt empty, a warm loaf became a kind of offering, a message that I see you, I remember. Wrapped in linen, the loaves were left quietly at doorsteps. No knock, no call, just a soft bundle resting beside the threshold. Sometimes with a note, sometimes it wasn't. The smell of fresh bread did the speaking. In some homes, children helped knead. In others, it was the elderly who remembered how to do it. Each loaf is different, imperfect, round or flat, cracked or golden, but all baked with care. Even when food was scarce, flour was saved for this. Not every gift was returned, not every loaf was received, but still people baked, not as a cure or comfort, but as a treasure, a way to reach out when hands could not touch, when voices stayed behind doors, and the only thing that moved freely was the scent of something warm made by human hands. It wasn't just bread, it was a presence in a time when absence filled every room. Part 17. A visit from the nurse. She didn't knock loudly, just two gentle taps, barely enough to stir the silence inside. Then she waited. Sometimes a long time, sometimes no one came. But when they did, they opened the door slowly, cautiously, and always with tired eyes. The nurse stood there in plain clothes, not in uniform. Her coat was worn. A cloth mask covered her mouth, tied tightly behind her head. In one hand she carried a bag, soft, sagging, full of bottles, gauze, and folded paper. In the other, a thermos, or maybe a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She didn't stay long. She quiet greeting. A few questions whispered. She listened to the cough. She felt the forehead. Sometimes she left a bottle. Sometimes just instructions. Keep the room warm. Boil water for steam. Write a letter to the neighbor if things worsened. Children watched from behind doorways, peeking through the cracks. Others stood quietly nearby, hands clasped in front of them, saying little. They knew she was tired. They knew she had walked far. They knew she would leave and visit the next town, and then the next, repeating the same slow rhythm day after day. She didn't promise years, only presence. She didn't ask for payment, only silence to listen. She didn't give hope easily, but her visit meant someone still came. Someone still stepped through the quiet streets, crossed thresholds, and carried the weight of care from one home to another. When she left, the door would close just as softly as it had opened. The family inside would sit still for a moment longer, not better, not cured, but not forgotten either. That mattered. In those days, it mattered more than most things. Part 18. Gloves, pens, and paper notes. They didn't knock anymore. By now, most people knew not to touch. Doors opened, just a crack. Gloves stayed on. Eyes met briefly and then looked away again. Words were short, rehearsed, or written down. Notes replaced voices. Folded scraps of paper pinned to door frames or tucked beneath a jar. I left some soup. She's resting. Please knock if you need anything. They were written in pencil, in careful handwriting, often by candlelight, and they meant everything. Cloth gloves, not sterile, just common winter gloves, were worn even indoors, not for warmth, but for distance. When hands passed something to another hand, the fabric stayed between, a barrier of kindness. Small pins held the world together, notes on blankets, messages above beds, reminders on jars in the hallway. Boil before drinking. Don't forget to eat. He's still sleeping. Sometimes they were hopeful, sometimes heartbreaking, but always necessary. In apartment buildings, people tied notes to strings and lowered them from the window. Others left chalk marks on doors or tied ribbons to gateposts to signal we are all right, we are not. Entire conversations happened without a word spoken, a language of absence and presence. Paper became precious. Used envelopes were turned inside out. Scraps from old schoolbooks were torn and reused. The pencil stubs grew smaller with each message. No one cared about grammar, they cared about connection. No one saved these notes. Most were thrown away after reading, but in the moment, they were bridges between rooms, between apartments, between people who didn't want to be alone, but had to be. Even now, if one were to walk through a neighborhood like that, long after the silence lifted, they might still feel the ghost of a paper note fluttering quietly in the wind. Part 19. The piano in the quiet room. The piano sat in the corner, untouched. Once it had been the heart of the room, the place where Sunday evenings came alive with song and laughter. Children crowded around as fingers danced across worn ivory keys. Grandmother played waltzes. Someone always hummed along. It filled the house with life. But now, the lid stayed closed. Dust began to settle on its surface, fine and gray. The sheet music had not been turned in weeks. A single page curved slightly at the edges, frozen mid-melody. No one sat on the stool anymore. No one dared raise their voice, let alone the tune. In those long days of the pandemic, silence wasn't simply absence. It was presence, of worry, of waiting. Each cough from the next room stilled the air. Each step across the floorboards was measured, gentle, as though even noise could spread the illness. The piano waited, silently. It witnessed whispered conversation, meals eaten in fragments, letters read with shaking hands. It saw the nurse come and go. It saw the curtains pulled tighter. It felt the house grow smaller, quieter, and heavier. And still, it waited. Someone passed by once and touched a single key, just one. It made a sound, soft, warm, and utterly out of place. The person froze, half shocked by the suddenness of it. Then they moved on. The room swallowed the note whole. Later, perhaps it would be played again. Perhaps children would once more run their fingers over the keys. Perhaps the music would return tentatively, at first, then bold. But for now, the piano kept its silence, not broken, just waiting. Part 20. Fresh air and window sills. They moved the bed closer to the window. It wasn't because the view was beautiful. It really was. Just rooftops and chimneys, perhaps the shadow of a tree. But in the time of illness, the window became something more, a promise of air, of light, of the world still turning. Fresh air, that was the hope. Doctors spoke of it in gentle certainties. Keep the windows open, they said. The air must move, even in winter, even in the damp. Blankets piled high, but still the pane stayed cracked. The breeze, cold and steady, was believed to carry health, or at least keep sickness from settling. And so the sick were placed near the sills, some in hospital wards, others in their homes, surrounded by silence and flannel. They breathed in the street sounds, wagon wheels, bird song, distant church bells that no longer rang hours for services. The outside world, faint but present. Sometimes someone would set a glass of water on the sill, or a photograph, or a folded note, little altars of hope in the simplest places. Curtains fluttered gently like breath itself, and each movement spent near the window felt like a kind of prayer, not spoken, but lived. Children waved from across narrow alleyways. Neighbors nodded through the glass. The sun came and went, and with it a sense that time still passed, that someone, recovering, might one day rise, open that window, not to breathe in, but to look out, to see. The window became more than a window. It was the edge of two worlds, inside and out, illness and life, waiting and returning. And so they placed the bed there not for the view, but for the air, and for the hope that drifted through it. Part 21. Grief Behind Closed Doors. Grief in 1918 was often quiet. There were no large funerals, no lines of mourners in black, no long embraces at the church steps. When someone passed, the news was passed in whispers, a curtain drawn in the morning light, a door left gently ajar, a candle flickering longer than usual in the window. People grieved in silence because they had no other choice. To lose someone during the pandemic was to endure sorrow without ceremony. Many households were under quarantine. No one could come in, no one could come out. Families sat in the same rooms where illness had taken its hold, now made quieter by absence. There were no wakes, no gatherings, just the stillness. Inside, someone might sit in the hallway, holding a scarf that still carried a scent. Someone else might wash linens not to use again, but simply because it was something to do. A child might ask where their sibling had gone, and received only a soft touch in reply. The walls held in more than air, they held in mourning. People found small ways to mark their loss, a black ribbon tied to the knob of a front door, a letter folded and placed on an empty chair, a Bible left open to a favorite psalm. There were no eulogies, but there were glances, long and knowing, that spoke all that needed to be said. Even laughter, when it came again, felt like something borrowed, something delicate, because when grief came behind closed doors, it didn't knock, it simply settled in, quiet and enduring. There were no headlines for these moments, no stories in the paper, but behind every shuttered home there was a family adjusting to a space now larger by one missing soul, and in that space grief took root, not loudly, but deeply. Part 22. Funeral without voices. There was no choir, no procession through the streets, no carriages lined up in black, no gathered crowd beneath the trees. In 1918, death came quietly, and funerals came quieter still. For many families, the service was held not in a church, but in the front room of their own homes. The body, often already sealed in a pine box by gloved hands, was placed near a window. A black cloth was draped over a small table. A single vase held one flower, if any could be found in the season. Mourners did not gather. They stood at a distance, if they came at all. Masks over their faces, hats pulled low. No one lingered, no one embraced. Eyes met, but voices didn't rise. There was no singing, only the rustle of coat sleeves, the soft thump of footsteps on wooden floors. Sometimes, if one listened closely, a whisper of a prayer. Even the bells were quiet. In many cities, church bells had stopped ringing altogether. The dead too many, too frequent, the risks of gathering too high. A funeral in 1918 wasn't a ceremony, it was a farewell. Some coffins were lowered into the earth with no one watching, just the grave digger, the pastor, and the wind. Others were buried under cover of night or delayed for days until someone could find a space to rest the dead. People mourned behind doors. The ritual wasn't in the act, it was in the stillness. A candle lit in the hallway, a ribbon on the fence, a name whispered before sleep. The silence of those funerals echoed louder than any hymn. It was a silence full of love, of fear, of absence, and of quiet resolve. Part 23. Letters to the Departed. Some letters were never meant to be sent. In the late months of 1918 and early 1919, paper became more than a way to communicate. It became a vessel for grief. When families could no longer gather, when voices were stilled by distance and danger, people turned to pen and ink to say what they could not say aloud. These letters were written in bedrooms, in kitchen tables, or sitting quietly on porches. They were addressed not to government offices or hospitals, but to the dead, to husbands, to sisters, to sons, to neighbors who vanished from the street. They began simply, "Dearest," or "I still set your place at dinner." Some were full of sorrow, apologies left unsaid, memories replayed. Others held anger. Why did you leave when we needed you? Some letters were factual, telling the deceased of the weather, or how the chickens were doing, or what the newspaper said. They were written with shaking hands in silence, the writer alone with the page. Outside, the world was too quiet, too cautious. Inside, ink spelled what voices could no longer carry. These letters were rarely mailed. Most were folded and placed into drawers, tucked beneath pillows, pressed into Bibles. Some were left on windowsills, as if they might drift into the wind. Others were burned, not to forget, but to send the words upward into whatever came next. People didn't always believe the dead would read them. That wasn't the point. The writing was for the ritual. The paper held the weight. The act itself was the goodbye. And in a time when funerals were hushed and churches were closed, and goodbyes had to be imagined instead of heard, those letters were often the only thing that made parting feel real. Part 24. Laundry and bleach. The backyard smelled of steam and sun. In 1918, cleanliness became more than custom. It became ritual, not the kind found in churches, but in wash tubs and drying lines, in the rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing, in the quiet determination of hands that had run out of ways to protect. People boiled water not just for tea, but for clothes, shirts, pillowcases, kerchiefs, anything that might carry danger. Buckets were filled with lye, with vinegar, with bleach when it could be found. The scent of linen was no longer sweet. It stung the nose, it bit the skin, but people washed anyway. They didn't trust what they couldn't see. Invisible sickness clung to collars. Fear soaked into every thread. So they scrubbed harder than before until their fingers cracked and the water turned gray. Washing took hours. There were no machines, only washboards and basins, soap made from fat and ash, and sometimes nothing but hot water and salt. Women bent over buckets in kitchens and yards, sleeves rolled to the elbow, faces turned away from the steam, lines stretched between windows, between trees, between hope and necessity. White sheets flapped in the wind like soft flags of resistance. In the silence of isolation, they spoke of care, of trying. Some scrubbed until the fabric wore thin. Some washed the same shirt over and over, not because they had many, but because they had only one. And it had to be safe, or feel like it was. It wasn't about being clean. It was about doing what one could, with what little one had, against what no one could see. And when the laundry was done, when the sun had dried every edge and the air smelled faintly of bleach and wind, there was a kind peace in it, a small victory, a way to say, I still care, I still fight, I'm still here. Part 25. Soothe pots and chairs, walls. You did what you could with what you had. In the winter of 1918, when the streets had emptied and the news grew quieter but heavier, some kitchens still carried warmth, not the warmth of voices or laughter, but the slow, steady heat of something cooking, something meant to help. Soup became more than food. It became language. It became care in a pot. It was rarely rich, a few carrots, a half onion, bone broth, if there was any meat left on the bone, cabbage boiled until it wilted, bread crushed softened into the steam. It didn't matter how thin the broth was, it was warm, and it could be passed along. Neighbors who once shared doorsteps and songs now spoke through walls. They knocked gently, or didn't knock at all. Instead, they left things, a pot on the step, covered with cloth, a folded note beneath it, sometimes just steam rising in the cold air. Signaling someone had come and gone. Not everyone was strong enough to cook. Not everyone could chew. But even a warm spoonful of broth, something more than nutrients. It reminded the sick they were not entirely forgotten. There was no ceremony, just action. A mother wrapping the handle of the pot with a rag. A child walking down the hall, avoiding eye contact. A widower carefully ladling the soup into two bowls, out of habit before remembering. Sometimes the pots came back empty. Sometimes they came back full with soup of a different kindness. A silent reply. Others, other times they were never returned. That, too, was understood. This was how people said, I know you are there. I can't visit, but I care. Eat what you can. Just rest. In a world of closed doors and quiet fears, the smell of broth behind a wall meant more than any words. Part 26. Hope Notes in the Hallway. There were days when the hallway said more than any voice. In apartment buildings across the cities, where footsteps had once echoed freely, silence settled in. Doors stayed closed, curtains drawn. But now and then, something would appear beneath a door frame. Not a package, not food, but a note. A square of paper, folded once, tucked carefully against the wood, written in pencil or charcoal or whatever could be found. A sentence, maybe two. We are still okay. I heard coughing last night. Are you alright? Soup on your step. Stay warm. They weren't letters. They weren't meant for long replies. They were proof of breath, of thought, of human concern that still lived behind the walls. Some wrote daily, some wrote only once, but the notes became part of the architecture, taped to doorways, slit into cracks, hung from nails with bits of twine, and they stayed there, fluttering when someone passed by, like messages from the wind. Children sometimes added drawings, grouped hearts, stick figure smiles, flowers with too many petals. Even when they didn't understand the sickness, they understood kindness. These notes were not loud. They did not demand answers. They were simple declaration of presence, a way to say, I remember you, I'm here too. For the elderly woman on the third floor, a note became her morning ritual, writing a short line, placing it beside the hallway light, just in case someone walked by, still reading. One read. It stayed there for a week. No one tore them down. No one ignored them. They were read in passing or reread in solitude. In the absence of touch, of visits, of voices, these scraps of paper held more comfort than anyone could have guessed. In 1918, hope was fragile, but it was written in small handwriting, quiet ink, and the spaces between doors. Part 27. The library without readers. The doors weren't locked, but no one came. At the heart of many towns, there had once been a rhythm. Children running up stone steps, women in shawls returning borrowed books, old men nodding over newspapers. Libraries were quiet but designed, but they had always been alive. In 1918, the silence changed. The chairs stayed empty. The papers remained folded. The wooden card catalog went untouched. Its drawers closed like unsaid sentences. A layer of dust settled on the globe in the corner. A world no one could visit now, even by imagination. Some books remained open on the tables, left behind in haste. A novel mid-chapter, a medical journal beside a coat, a poetry collection with a breast flower still marking someone's place. The librarian came still for a time. She straightened the shelves, opened the window just enough to let in air but not too much. She wiped the handles with cloth soaked in vinegar. She waited. No one came. Outside, the city grew still. The park across the street emptied. Even the birds seemed to sing less. Inside, the books waited. Rows of spines stood like sentinels. The pages held breath. They had so much to offer: laughter, heartbreak, facts, escape, but no hands reached them. Eventually, even the librarian stayed home. Her keys hung by the door. The library grew dim. Dust claimed more territory. But the books endured. They did not rot. They did not forget. They simply waited. And one day, long after the coffee had faded and the bells had rung, someone would return, open a cover, read the quiet scent of old paper, and pick up a story right where it had been left. Part 28. Diaries and the days blurred. At first, the dates were neat. March 11th, March 12th, March 13th. Each morning, someone would open their diary and mark the day. The entries were ordinary at first. The weather, a list of chores, a note about who had visited or what the doctor had said. The handwriting was steady, confident. The rhythm of life still held. But as the day passed, the city grew quieter, so did the writing. The days began to lose their edges. The ink changed, sometimes faint, sometimes rushed. One entry ended mid-sentence. Another simply read, "He didn't come home last night." People stopped writing the day of the week. There was no need. No church on Sunday, no school on Monday, no gathering on Thursday. Time flattened, like bread left too long on the table. It was just day, then another, then another. The diarist kept going. They wrote because it gave shape to the formless, because it kept their hands busy when their minds were tired, because it gave the illusion of control, even if only for a moment. A girl barely 10 drew pictures in the margins. Her mother always in bed. The doctor always frowning. Her cat cawed at her feet. She wrote the same sentence 4 days in a row. "I miss my school friends." One man, sick himself, used his journal as confession. Regrets, names he never called, people he hoped would forgive him. He wrote by candlelight, then tore the pages out one by one. Even those who never journaled before began to. On scraps of paper, backs of envelopes, pages from cookbooks. Some didn't write at all. They marked the days by scratches on the wall, tiny rituals to hold on to meaning. And then, just as suddenly as the entries had started, they stopped, sometimes with a date, sometimes without, sometimes with only one word: gone. Years later, these diaries would be found in attics, drawers, and boxes no one had opened in decades, and they would speak, softly, honestly, of a time when the calendar faded, and all that remained were feelings in ink. Part 29. Crows, bells, and silence. The air changed before the news did. You could feel it in your chest, in the hush between footsteps, in the long pauses between conversations. The sounds that once shaped the rhythm of daily life, the clang of trams, the laughter from windows, the rustle of market stalls, they began to vanish one by one, and something else arrived to take their place. The bell tower that once rang hourly grew quiet. At first, it was mechanical failure, they said, but it wasn't. The man who wound the bell had fallen ill, then his apprentice, and then no one came to replace them. The city, once ruled by charms, now marked time by silence, and in that silence came the crows. They perched on rooftops, on fences, on statues worn by weather. They circled above empty courtyards and fluttered along abandoned roads. People noticed them more now, black feathers against gray skies, eyes like polished stone. They didn't cry out often, but they did. It pierced the stillness. To some, the birds were messengers, to others, its omens. Children counted them from windows, one crow, two crows, three, and whispered superstition handed down by mothers who now refused to leave their rooms. Elsewhere, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Curtains barely moved. Leaves clung to branches as if uncertain. Doors no longer slammed. They creaked gently, as though afraid to make demands. No parades, no sermons, no singing. Instead, a new language emerged. Of course, in distant rooms, of kettle whistles in dim kitchens, of creaking floorboards under careful steps, of breath, shallow, slow, sometimes missing. A city is not defined by its skyline. It's defined by its sounds. And in 1918, the absence of sound said more than any headline. Part 30. Winter Inside and Out. Winter did not wait for the world to recover. It came as it always did, cold and unapologetic. The wind scraped against the windows. The frost crept in through the floorboards. And for many, the cold outside was easier to understand than the cold that had settled indoors. Firewood grew scarce. Coal delivers slowed. Those who had stoves burned them carefully, sparingly, one log for the morning, one for the night. Families gathered in the smallest rooms, huddled together under blankets, too thin for the reason. But it wasn't just the cold in their bones that wore them down. It was the absence of warmth between people. The laughter that once echoed off kitchen walls was now replaced by cautious whispers. Hands no longer reached across tables. Doors stayed closed even when someone knocked. Even voices seemed to retreat, hushed, tired, distant. Outside, the snow fell steadily, softening every sound. Streets were blanketed, not just in quiet, but in stillness. Footprints were filled. Chimneys smoked less. The neighborhood cat stopped making its rounds, and behind each frosted window, someone waiting for letters, for good news, for spring. Inside the homes, People lit candles not for celebration, but for light when power failed. They wrapped themselves in old scarves, in memory, in silence. The meals were simple, conversations similar still, time slowed. There were no carols that year, no midnight gatherings, no footprints leading to neighbors' doors. The world was quiet, but not in peace. It's in pause. And as the winter pressed on, so too did the people, each carrying a small flicker of warmth within them, not enough to chase away the cold, but enough to remember that seasons change eventually. Part 31. The girl in the red shawl. She stood at the same window every morning, not because there was much to see, the streets were nearly always empty now, but because it had become a ritual, a way to measure time, a way to be seen, even if no one was looking. She was small, no older than 8 or 9, wrapped in a red woolen shawl that once belonged to her older sister. The color had faded unevenly over the years, but in a street drained of color and movement, that patch of red stood out like a memory trying not to disappear. Each morning, after bread and broth, she climbed onto the wooden stool by the front window. Sometimes she waved to passing girls. Sometimes she watched a neighbor hanging laundry with gloved hands. Sometimes she just stared past the fogged glass, past the world that used to be, into a space where people gathered and smiled and untouched. Her mother told her not to go outside. Her father hadn't come home in 2 weeks, and so the window became her playground, her classroom, her stage. She imagined conversations. She mouthed songs she once heard in crowded kitchen. She drew hearts on glass when it frosted over. When it rained, she pretended two drops were messages. Someone knocking to say hello. The neighbors began to notice. Across the street, a shopkeeper started tipping his hat from inside his locked store. A nurse on a bicycle waved once, slowed and nodded. Even the postman, whose eyes rarely left his bag, glanced up now and then. They didn't know her name. She didn't know theirs, but her red shawl became a part of the block, like the lamp post, like the bricks, like the memory of Nomaki. Some days she didn't appear, and the window felt darker without her. Part 32. When smiles disappeared. It happened slowly, so slowly that most people didn't notice at first. At the start, the masks were temporary, folded cloth tied with string, sometimes made from handkerchiefs or strips of old curtains. They were odd at first, inconvenient, a thing to adjust and fidget with, but soon they became routine, expected, required. And then something disappeared. Smiles. You could still hear laughter sometimes, faint, nervous, shared between neighbors over fences. But the curve of grin, the twitch of amusement, and reassuring upturn of someone's mouth, they were hidden behind fabric. You began to guess. Was the baker smiling when he handed over the bread? Was the nurse frowning or just tired? Did the girl across the alley blush when your eyes met? Or was it just the cold? People looked at the eyes more. They became experts at reading the squint of laughter, the soft blink of sadness. A raised eyebrow spoke volumes, but it wasn't the same. Children stopped recognizing distant relatives. Elders complained they couldn't understand anymore. Words came muffled. Faces stayed blank. Entire conversations took place with only half the expression needed. And mirrors? They reflected only fragments, eyes above layers of cotton. Some people stopped looking altogether. Even portraits, old and dusty, felt more alive than the faces walking by in the street. The world hadn't gone silent, but it had grown less human, or at least less seen, as if the very idea of being seen had become dangerous. Of course, people still smiled behind the fabric, beneath the layers, but sometimes are meant to be shared, and where they vanished from sight, something softer vanished too, a kind of wordless warmth that passed between passengers, strangers, the silent way we told each other, I see you, you're still here. And when that disappeared, the days grew just a little colder. Part 33. Night shifts and pale lights. Night had its own rhythm during the pandemic, slower, dimmer, filled with sounds no one wanted to hear. In hospitals and makeshift clinics, the day never truly ended. Nurses moved through the halls like shadows, their footsteps muffled by fatigue and soft-soled shoes. The oil lamps flickered quickly, casting yellow halos on the walls. Electric lights, when available, were few and pale. Most buildings relied on whatever light they could find. The patients didn't sleep easily. Some tossed, some coughed through the dark. Others lay still, watched carefully by tired eyes. For many nurses, the night shift was a kind of silence, not peaceful, but tense. You never knew if the next room would need you. You didn't know who would make it to morning. Coffee ran cold. Paper mask sagged. Notes were scribbled in dim corners under candlelight. Hands were washed again and again, raw from soap and urgency. Sometimes there were moments of strange beauty, the way a lamp glowed on someone's cheek, the way a blanket was pulled up with care, the soft murmur of someone dreaming. The world outside was quiet, but inside, the life hovered at the edge. You might hear a piano in a distant house, a baby crying 2 floors down, a radio humming faintly from another room. These were the sounds that kept you grounded, that reminded you the world was still there. And when dawn finally crept in, pale and gray, it didn't feel like hope, not exactly. It felt like a pause, like breath, like the simple relief that, for now, the hallway was quiet and your shift was over, and tomorrow You would do it all again because you had to, because someone had to. Part 34. It's just a cold, and then it's not. At first, it was always just a cold, a tickle in the throat, a single cough, a mild ache behind the eyes. Someone would laugh and wave it off. The weather's turning, they'd say. Must be the dust in the air. No one wanted to believe it was anything more. Not again. There was comfort in pretending, in holding on to the rhythm of small illnesses, the familiar, harmless ones that came and went each season. People brewed tea, wrapped scarves tighter, took a spoon of honey, and kept walking. But the cold didn't go away, not this time. The cough deepened, fever arrived, and then the silence. The same story echoed across streets and cities. The one who brushed off the sniffle was now behind curtains, isolated. Their windows were shut. Visitors stopped coming. Neighbors whispered. The smell of vinegar returned. The towels were hung by the bed, and someone, maybe the same one who had laughed, began to wonder if they should have said something sooner. Regret became part of the illness. Mothers who tucked children in with the kids suddenly stayed back at the doorway. Friends stopped dropping by unannounced. A sneeze in the market made people turn. A cough on the tram cleared half the round. The phrase, "it's just a cold," didn't disappear, but it no longer brought comfort. It became a warning, a hope, a denial dressed in familiarity. By the time the town understood, the pattern had already moved on, from one house to another, from mild to severe, and by then no one said it lightly anymore. "It's just a cold," someone whispered, and in the quiet that followed, everyone heard the weight of what it might become. Part 35. The cat still comes home. Every evening, around the same time, the cat returned. She was never in a hurry. She didn't knock. She didn't meow. She simply appeared on the same windowsill, under the same grouped tile, as if nothing in the world has changed. Inside the building, every had changed. Curtains were drawn, voices were hushed, shoes were lined up outside doors that didn't open. But the cat kept coming. Sometimes she waited, sometimes she didn't. Sometimes a hand would reach out and place a saucer of milk near the sill, quietly, cautiously, without a word. No one really knew where the cat went during the day. Perhaps she wandered alleyways to sunbathe on rooftops. Perhaps she visited another homes, or none at all. But each night she returned. To some, she was just a creature of habit. To others, a small reassurance that the world still had rhythm, even if it was different now. There were those who began timing their evenings by her. "She's late tonight," they would whisper, or "Ah, there she is," like clockwork. Children who no longer played in courtyards watched her from behind lace curtains. Elderly hands waved without being seen. Someone even left a ribbon once, red and fraying, tied loosely near her favorite spot. And still she came. through quarantine, through silence, through grief. The cat didn't ask questions. She didn't mourn or worry. She simply came home. In a time when routines fell apart and doors stayed shut, it was a little things. The paw on the sill, the swish in a tail, the blink of yellow eyes. That reminded people the life, in its own quiet way, still found a way back. Part 36. Home haircuts and glass soap. When the shops closed, the barbers vanished behind shuttered windows. The scissors came out of drawers. At first, it was awkward. Fathers trimming the ends of daughters' hair with trembling hands. Mothers squinting as they tried to straighten bangs by candlelight. Mirrors were leaned against chairs. Hair was swept into neat little piles, and no one quite looked the same afterward. But it became a ritual, these quiet afternoons with towels around shoulders and someone saying, just a little off the sides. Laughter echoed more than complaints. You look like a monk. Someone would joke. Better than before. Another would lie. And suddenly, imperfections felt like a badge of time passed together. The same went for laundry. With factories silent and deliveries uncertain, the shelves grew empty. Soap was rationed. Bottles reused. People made their own boiled down cloth soap from bits of lye and fat, mixed with ash or vinegar. It smelled sharp, but it worked, mostly. Children helped stir. Grandmothers remembered recipes they hadn't touched in decades. Bed sheets were beaten against stones. Shirts dried stiff under weak winter sunlight. The smell of clean, even when it wasn't perfect, felt like victory. Everything took longer. A haircut took an hour. So did a bar of soap. But it filled the time, the long, silent time. And in those moments, with scissors clicking and suds in buckets, the world, though unfamiliar, felt a little more held together. Part 37. The birthday nobody came to. There were balloons, 3 of them, tied to a chair in the corner. A paper ground sat waiting on the table, beside a cake that had only one candle. The frosting was a little lopsided, the sprinkles sparse. It didn't matter. The cake had been made with care, from flour that had been saved and sugar that had been stretched thin over weeks. It was a birthday, not the first to be celebrated this way, but still its own. No knocking at the door, no shoes piled in the hallway, no cousins or friends arriving with paper-wrapped gifts or sticky hugs. Only 2 voices sang happy birthday, off key, soft but trying. The child glad anyway, cheeks pink from the glow of that single flame. In a photograph taken later, they wore the ground. They smiled. Behind them, the balloons bobbed gently, like they were trying to cheer someone up. The room was quiet afterward. The cake was eaten. A card from a grandparent lay flat on the table. delivered days before, and read again and again. Outside, the world was still, the sky was unchanged, but inside, in this tiny ceremony, a year had passed. Birthdays came even when no one else did, and somehow that was enough. Part 38. A hug across the window. The glass was cold. One pair of hands on the inside, one on the outside. Both pressed flat against the pane, fingers spread, palms lined up as if trying to remember the shape of each other. They didn't speak. Their mouths moved, yes, through smiles and silence. I miss you. But the glass held their voices, muffled them into nothing but breath and fog. One person stood outside in a coat and scarf, hands bare. The other sat in a chair inside, wrapped in blankets. Their eyes met across that thin, unbreakable wall. It wasn't enough, but it was everything. No one dared open the door. Not now. Not with the news. Not with the neighbor 2 floors down who hadn't answered in days. But they came anyway, every day, to stand there for a few minutes, to press their love into glass. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they laughed and told jokes that couldn't be heard. Sometimes they simply stood, hand to hand, separated by nothing but the price of staying safe. It wasn't a hug, but it was a kind of embrace, the kind that lives longer than arms can stretch. And when they walked away, one down the sidewalk, the other deeper into the house, they both turned back, just once. The window stayed quiet, but it remembered. Part 39. The breath that was saved. It had been days, maybe more, since she last spoke. The cough that had taken her voice, the fever, her strength, and the long nights, well, they had taken nearly everything else. The window beside her bed had been opened just enough to let in the cold morning air. Sheets were damp from sweat. The bowl of broth on the nightstand and had gone untouched. But then something shifted. A small inhale, shallow, weak but different. Then another, longer this time. Then one more, a little stronger still. She opened her eyes, barely, and blinked at the ceiling as if it were unfamiliar. The nurse noticed first. She leaned in, whispering gently, as if not to scare the breath away. A hand touched the patient's shoulder. Another breath, then another. It was dramatic. There was no sudden gasp or cry of relief, just the slow return of life, quiet and persistent, like the first bird after winter. Her family would be told later. Her name, which had been written in smaller and smaller print on the list of critical cases, would be crossed off, not in mourning, but in hope. Outside, the day was bright, not warm, but clear, the kind of sky that makes people look up without meaning to. And somewhere, someone's exhaled a long, shaking breath they didn't realize they were holding. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough. One breath, then another. That's how life begins again. Part 40. Life after the mask. It started slowly. One person walked outside with their face uncovered, hesitant, unsure if the air had truly changed. Another followed, clutching a mask in their hand, as if afraid they still need it at any moment. Shops opened again. Windows that had stayed shuttered for months were washed and brought wide. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks they hadn't touched since autumn. Church bells returned softly at first, like they, too, were testing the world again. It wasn't sudden. No one declared the fear gone. No trumpet sounded at the end. But something in the air was different. It smelled like bread baking, like warm soil, like laundry hung outside again. People still walked a path, not from fear, but from habit. Eyes still searched for signs of sickness in strangers, but more often now they looked for smiles. And smiles came back slowly, awkwardly, but they came. There were quiet conversations on porches, letters folded neatly and handed directly instead of slipped under doors. A child laughed in public, and no one flinched. Masks didn't disappear, they hung from books, rested in coat pockets. They had become part of the story, a reminder, not of fear, but of care. And as the sun poured onto streets that had once stood silent, someone leaned out a window, took a deep breath, and whispered, "It feels like life." And this time it was.